LeBlanc. Hi, Minister. Good to see you. Thank you for making the time.
Good morning, Vashi.
Do you think there's any way of getting out of these tariffs before Tuesday?
I'm very pessimistic that by Tuesday we can get out. My conversations with Howard Lutnick and others in the administration tell me that perhaps in March there's a window again, but most of this is so unpredictable. Our job is to be ready for what Mr. Trump did yesterday. We were ready. We responded as Canadians would expect us to respond. And if the main issue is borders and fentanyl flow into the United States, we think there's a positive story to tell about the cooperation between Canada and the United States. Fentanyl has had devastating effects in our country as well. Less than 1%, as you know, of the fentanyl in the United States has ever been sourced to Canada. But 1% is 1% too much. So if they want to work with us and if they want us to do more, we've shown them and said that we'll do what's necessary to deal with this. But I wonder if that's the actual pretext or if there's another policy objective that they're pursuing.
Well, I wanted to ask you because the executive order makes it seem like, and some of Trump's threats have made it seem like this is about the border. He's also talked, at great length about the so-called beauty, quote unquote, or the utility that he sees in tariffs, that he wants to harken back to an era where tariffs were essentially the main source of revenue for the United States. Do you think that's what this is about? I've
wondered that too, and I remember the initial conversation at Mar-a-Lago when I went with the Prime Minister at the end of November. And you're right, there is a policy thought in many in his administration that it's a good economic policy and industrial policy for the United States. I don't know. I don't think it's up to us to imagine what is moving Mr. Trump to make these decisions. Our job is to stand up for the Canadian economy, stand up for Canadian workers, and ultimately we're convinced the American administration, because of the pain it will inflict on American consumers and American businesses. What he did yesterday, in our view and in the view of many economists and business leaders in the United States, was extremely negative for his own population. So does it take some weeks for him to see that, as was the case 6 or 7 years ago? Maybe. The important thing for us is to, in the interim, to be there to support Canadian businesses and Canadian workers.
And I have questions about how your government plans to do that in a moment. You mentioned your conversations with Howard Lutnick in the possibility of sort of a window in March. Based on those conversations, first of all, can you explain why you have a sense that that would be a window? But also, do you think that his incoming commerce secretary, or people around him at the very least, are understanding of the point that you just made, that this will have an impact on American consumers? Because he, again, refutes that in a number of interviews. I don't agree that's not the case. Tariffs won't drive up prices.
Yeah, so two questions. I think, I assume a lot of people in the Trump administration are successful business people. A lot of the great American entrepreneurs have been playing a role in his administration and his election. And if you read what many of them are saying, what economists are saying, what senators and governors from the northern border states are saying, that this will have devastating impacts on their own businesses and their own consumers. So we believe that to be true. I think objectively there's a lot of evidence that that's the case. How long does it take for the Trump administration to come to that conclusion? Who knows? You asked about the March deadline. In my conversations with Mr. Lutnick, they were very cordial. He has been quite open with me. He's obviously waiting until his confirmation hearing. He said to me that he would be happy to have me as his first meeting at 9 o'clock the morning after his confirmation hearing. He's not obviously exercising the function of Commerce Secretary yet, until the confirmation vote, I should say. But there is a process that the President set up with this sort of global review of trade practices and taxation, extraterritorial taxation, which concludes on April 1st. And then there's a broader discussion, much more nuanced, about the North American economy, CUSMA, the free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. So that conversation feels more structured than a discussion about fentanyl and the border. and Mexican cartels, when the evidence would show that Canada is not, in fact, the biggest source of threat, but recognizing the shared objective of wiping out the damage that fentanyl is doing, we're prepared and have stepped up. So if that conversation, my colleagues met Tom Homan, Mr. Trump's borders are. So there's a lot of these conversations ongoing, but like much of this, it's rather unpredictable.
Has there been any communication to you or the federal government more largely that when these counter tariffs that you announced last night come into effect, that the tariffs from the United States could escalate?
But we took note again of what was in the executive order yesterday, and there's been a lot of commentary about that. We believe that we didn't start this disruption. We were working collaboratively, as we have for decades, with the United States, economically, in terms of national security, defense security. Mr. Trump decided to do this and make it effective on Tuesday. Canadians expected the government of Canada to respond. It would have been rather remarkable that we didn't respond in terms of applying a similar package of tariffs to imports into Canada from the United States. That's exactly what we did. $150 billion of imports from the United States into Canada is a big chunk of their sales of consumer products and other materials. But no, Canada won't benefit from this continued back and forth, and neither will the United States.
Do you think there will be a continued back and forth, though? Do you anticipate that those tariffs are going up? Has there been anything explicit communicated to you?
Nothing more than what was said publicly by the president and in the executive order. But as I said, we've accepted that unpredictability in this context will be the normal. So we're ready to do what is necessary.
Okay, speaking of that, we spoke to Lana Payne last night, who heads up Uniform, obviously represents a number of tens of thousands of auto workers across the country. We spoke to a number of different auto industry representatives who all said that the auto industry literally will shut down in the next week following the imposition of these tariffs. How far are you prepared to go to support those workers, and doesn't Parliament need to be in session to make that happen?
So again, two questions. The last question, no, we believe that the government has the instruments necessary to support workers and Canadian businesses in the current context. What we did last night, what we can do with programs like employment insurance, what we can do with what I can do in terms of providing liquidity, financial assistance to businesses through the Crown Corporations, Export Development Canada, Business Development Canada. There's a lot of instruments. I know that the Deputy Minister of Finance, the Governor of the Bank of Canada are meeting the leaders of Canada's 6 biggest banks today to decide and to discuss with them what instruments are necessary to support sectors of the economy, to the example of the auto sector that will be hard hit. So we'll be there to support these businesses. We think we have all the instruments and the programs available to do so. The provinces will also step up. The provinces, I was with the Prime Minister in this conversation with all the premiers yesterday. Every one of them talked about the importance of working together to support businesses and workers. They didn't create this circumstance. The people that are going to work tomorrow in the auto industry in Ontario, the lobster fishers in Nova Scotia, the Bay of Fundy, there's a lobster season on now. A great number of those lobsters are sold in Boston. So you could see how this very quickly becomes very difficult for these parts of the economy, and it'll roll across the country in different ways. But the provinces will work with us, and we'll be there to support businesses and workers.
What if, though, Minister, with all respect, you do need to come to Parliament to have, extraordinary measures like during the pandemic, like CERB, like whatever it happens to be. I mean, we're talking about an entire industry, the backbone of the most populous province in this country, which could collapse in a week. And are you really telling Canadians that their parliamentarians shouldn't be debating, discussing, representing them in deciding how to best address this? And what message does that send to the U.S.?
We'll make all the decisions necessary to support workers and businesses. So if that circumstance that you described turns out to be the case, obviously we would do what is necessary.
So you're not going to avoid it just to stave off an election, to be clear?
Well, but again, therein lies the contradiction. The opposition parties have vowed at the first opportunity to cause an election. That's a guaranteed way to make sure that Parliament doesn't meet for 2 or 3 more months. So they can't have it both ways. You can't say, hurry up, bring Parliament back because we want to have an election, which would mean that Parliament would not be.
But I mean, the timing is essentially set off by the Prime Minister deciding at the point he did to vacate his position. I mean, it's not the opposition's fault that he waited until he did.
I don't. The issue is, does the government have the necessary instruments and programs to support sectors of the economy and workers? The answer is yes. The politics of people parading around the foyer of the House of Commons with manufactured outrage, you've been around long enough, Vashti, that's a whole separate conversation. The focus that we think Parliament and parliamentarians should have is what they can do in their communities to, frankly, give voice to the business leaders and to the workers that are concerned about this. And you have 13 premiers and a federal government that have said they'll work together to do what's necessary. I think we should be careful not to talk about a COVID-like circumstance. Some people have done that. I haven't done that. COVID is where the government of Canada shut down entire sectors of the economy for a public health emergency.
But I mean, entire sectors of the economy could be shut down because of this.
Absolutely, and the government will be there to support them.
Okay, I got to leave it there. I'm out of time. I appreciate your time, Minister. Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend, Vashti. Thank you.
Dominic will be